In this part of the video, I'm going to talk about the group of people that supervises research with human participants at a university to make sure that it's being done ethically. This group of people is called an IRB, or Institutional Review Board. Every university that receives federal funding and support to do research with human participants has to set up an IRB. And the main job of an IRB is to pre-screen every study that's being planned with human participants and to make a decision about whether the study should be done or shouldn't be done. If an IRB decides that a study that's being planned isn't ethical and it's has too much unnecessary risk, then they will deny the study. And if an IRB decides that the study is ethical, then they will approve the study and it can be done. And anytime a person is, like I said, anytime a person is planning to do a study with human participants at a university, that person has to get the university's IRB approval first before beginning the study. So if a researcher is doing a study that's very low risk and the researcher feels confident about getting approval, the researcher can't just try to get a head start and start collecting data before getting approval, because if a researcher does do that, the IRB will say that all of the data that was collected before getting approval has to be thrown away. It can't be used. So even if a person feels sure that they'll get the approval, they have to wait until actually getting approval before they start. I also wanted to mention that the IRB doesn't have to approve student projects. So if a student on a campus is doing a research project like a survey, and it's just a classroom project that's being done for a grade, the person doesn't have to get IRB approval before starting, because the IRB doesn't consider student projects to be research. Now, the IRB considers a study to be actual research if the researcher is planning to publish the results in a journal or present the results at a conference. In other words, an IRB considers a study to be research if the researcher is planning to share the results with the public in some way and contribute to the knowledge of the field. So if you're a student in a class and you're doing a research project and you actually do want to publish it or present it somewhere, then you actually do have to get the IRB approval first. So now I'd like to move ahead and talk about how an IRB makes a decision about whether to approve a study. They use something called risk-benefit analysis. So let me explain what this means. Risk-benefit analysis is just the process of deciding if the benefits of something outweigh the risks. It's deciding if there are more pros than cons. So it might help to imagine that scale that I talked about earlier with the red checkers on the left side and the black checkers on the right side. Imagine that the red checkers are benefits that'll come from doing the research, and the black checkers are risks or possible harm. The IRB will look to see if the red checkers weigh more than the black checkers, and if they do, then they'll approve the study. That's basically what risk-benefit analysis is, and I'm not sure what exact process or formula the IRB uses to make a decision about a study, but I know that it's called risk-benefit analysis, and I just want you to understand what this term means. And now let's talk about the makeup of an IRB. Who actually serves on an IRB? Well, an IRB is a small group of people. I'm not sure what the exact number is. And it has to be a mixture of scientists and non-scientists, which means that the IRB can't be completely made up of scientists who are doing research. There has to be at least one non-scientist on the IRB, just to bring in a different perspective. Also, an IRB has to have at least one person from the outside community who's not involved with the university in any other way, just because they bring in an outside perspective. And now let's talk about the steps of getting a study approved by an IRB. Let's quickly talk about what a researcher has to do to get approval or to try to get approval for a study. So first of all, a researcher submits an application with some supporting materials to the IRB. I showed you how to submit the application, or I'm sorry, I showed you how to fill out an IRB application in our first lab. That application goes to the IRB coordinator who reviews it, and the IRB coordinator decides that the study is exempt from being reviewed. And if the IRB coordinator decides that it is exempt, then it gets automatic approval. In that case, the IRB doesn't have to sit down and look over the details of the study that's being planned. It just gets automatic approval. And in lab, I showed you what the exempt categories are, and I said that if your study fits into one of them, you get the automatic approval. Now, if you're the researcher, you can't say that since I fit into one of these categories, I'm not going to even apply to the IRB because I know I'm exempt anyway. You can't do that. You still have to submit your application, and the IRB gets to decide if you get the automatic approval. You can't just do that yourself. And if the IRB coordinator decides that the study is not exempt and it does have to be reviewed, then a single member of the IRB called a reviewer will review the application and look over the details, and the reviewer will decide if the study should have an expedited review or a full review. Those are the two types of reviews that can be done. So the word expedited means fast, so expedited review is a fast review. If the reviewer decides to give an expedited review, then the reviewer does a one-person review. The reviewer looks over the application and makes a decision without passing it on to other members of the IRB. But if the reviewer decides that it needs a full review, then the entire IRB will look over the application at its next meeting and make a decision. So if a study has minimal risk, meaning the risk is not any higher than everyday life, then it'll get the expedited review. But if a study has a higher level of risk, or if it includes people who are vulnerable in some way, like people with certain conditions, then it'll have to have a full review. And ultimately, a decision is reached. In this video, I won't go over all the specific decisions that can be reached, because there are different types of decisions that can be reached besides just yes and no. You can get a conditional approval, or you can get a complete approval. I gave the details of those in your assignment for this week. So let's move ahead. Now I want to talk about the rules that a researcher has to follow after getting approval from the IRB. So after a researcher gets the approval, the researcher has to follow some rules to keep the IRB's approval and not to get in trouble with the IRB. First of all, the researcher has to minimize risk. The researcher has to avoid having any unnecessary danger, and he or she has to minimize risk physically and psychologically. And second, the researcher has to update the IRB about any changes to the plans of the study, even if they're minor. So if the researcher decides to recruit more participants, have a bigger sample, then the person has to update the IRB about that. And if the researcher decides to recruit different types of people who weren't originally planned to be in the study, that's another update that has to be made. Third, the researcher has to debrief the participants if they're being deceived. In some experiments, the researcher will actually lie to the participants before they enter the study. The researcher will lie about the purpose of the study, and the researcher will do that to keep the people from knowing what the study is about. Because if a participant knows what the study is about and knows what the researcher is testing, that might change the way they behave. They might not behave naturally. So in some cases, a researcher will lie about the purpose of the study just to keep people in the dark. And I'll share a couple of famous examples of studies with deception. So in the Milgram shock experiment, they actually told the participants that it was a study about, I think, the effects of reinforcement or negative reinforcement on learning or something like that. I can't remember exactly what they said, but the study was actually about obedience to authority. There was also another experiment called the Asch conformity study, in which they brought the participants into a room and sat them at a table. And actually, at the table, one person was a participant and everyone else was an actor who was in on the experiment. And the person came in, the researcher, and showed a card to everyone in the room with 2 lines on it. And one line was longer than the other. And each person was asked which line is longer. And the people had to answer one at a time. And all of the actors at the table gave the wrong answer one at a time. And once it was the participant's turn, they wanted to see if the participant would go with the group and give the wrong answer, or if they would stand up and give the right answer. So that study was actually about conformity, but they told each person that it was about vision, or about vision for lines, so they were deceived. And the APA, American Psychological Association, recommends to only use deception if it's necessary, if there are no other options. And if there is something else that can be done besides deception, you should do that instead. Fourth, a researcher needs to gather informed consent. In other words, the researcher has to tell each participant what they're getting into, what to expect, and also to ask each participant if they still want to be in the study. And usually, a researcher gets informed consent by having each person sign a consent form. When each person signs a consent form, they're saying, I was informed about what I'm getting into, and I still wanted to be in the experiment. But in some situations, informed consent isn't gathered. In some special situations, a participant doesn't sign a consent form, and I'll share them with you quickly. So if the participants are minors, under 18, then they don't sign a consent form. Instead, they're asked to verbally say if they agree to be in the study. And if they do, then a caregiver or a parent will sign the form for them. Also, if a study involves anonymous surveys, then the participants won't have to sign a consent form, because when a person returns a survey to a researcher, then that is considered consent, because if the person returns a survey, it means that they do want to be in the study. No one was forcing them to return the survey. And now let's wrap up this topic and talk about what ethical research involves beyond just treating participants ethically, because ethical research actually has more to it than that. So to do ethical research, you also have to avoid these 3 things: fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. So these are all considered fraud. They're deceptive and unethical because they harm the public or other researchers. So fabrication is when a person makes up a data set and pretends that it's real and publishes it. So if a person goes into a blank spreadsheet, and just makes up a bunch of numbers and makes some graphs and publishes it, that's fabrication. It's like cooking a set of results. If a person takes a real data set and just changes it a little bit to make the results look better, that's falsification, because the data is real. It was actually collected. Well, most of it was, but it was kind of changed just a little bit, so it's kind of falsified. And fabrication is plagiarism is when you take credit for someone else's work. And to avoid plagiarism, you have to use quotes if you're using another person's words, or you have to have a citation if you're using someone else's ideas. And when we think about plagiarism, we usually think about papers and writing, but there are other kinds of plagiarism. If you take a person's painting and say that it's yours, that's plagiarism, because you're taking credit for someone else's work. So all three of these are serious and have to be avoided.